Pardon me, Don. I'm going to grab a couple. Well, I want to welcome everyone tonight. My name is Kathy. I'm the director here at the Scott County Historical Society. We're really pleased to have a wonderful speaker with us tonight. But before we start, there's a couple things I want to say. On your chairs, you're going to find one of these bookmarks that'll tell you the things that we have coming up at the museum. I hope you come to visit us again. And if you're not a member, please consider becoming one. Right over here, we've got some membership sign-ups. When you do that, you can also register to get on our mailing list and an email list as well, so you can get advance notice of the things we have coming on. And if you like us, which I'm sure you do, there's envelopes over there to help us out a little bit with a little donation. So we appreciate that as well. So that business out of the way. Thank you again for coming tonight. I know it's a beautiful evening, so I appreciate your time. And what I'd love to do is to introduce Mr. Schleper. David Schleper grew up here in Shakopee, and he received a BA in Deaf Education and English at the University of Northern Colorado, and his MA in Deaf Education and English at Gallaudet University. He also completed postgraduate studies in writing at the University of New Hampshire. David taught for 20 years at all different grade levels, from elementary through graduate school, at the Hawaii School for the Deaf, Kendall Demonstration Elementary School, the Model Secondary School for the Deaf, Kapiolani Community College, and Gallaudet University. He's been a literacy coordinator for 2 lab schools at Gallaudet, I'm having trouble saying that name, of course, in Washington, D.C. David has also traveled to 49 states, given over 900 workshops and trainings, as well as training in several other countries, including Australia, Canada, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the United Arab Emirates. David is an avid reader and author of several articles and manuals on reading and writing with deaf children. He originated and developed the Shared Reading Project, which is a program to teach hearing families how to read with their deaf and hard of hearing children. Since his retirement, David has spent his time learning about American history, including women and people of color who lived in early Shakopee. He's involved with the Shakopee Heritage Society, writing articles and adding information to a blog, and talking about Shakopee history with 6th graders, which probably explains why there's some of these things on your chairs tonight. So please join me in welcoming David Schleper.
I know, I love the 6th graders, believe it or not. That's the strange part, I think. But I think that's partly just, if you actually work with 6th graders, I usually work with 6th, 7th, and 8th graders together. And what's really interesting is that they have so many questions, and they go beyond what I think, and they think something else, and it just makes you keep going, okay, and that kind of stuff. That thinking is kind of what I remember. I grew up here in Shakopee starting when I was age 2. We moved here from Belgrade, Minnesota. And my dad was an American history teacher and baseball coach and athletic director here in Shakopee. And when he and my dad and my mom, we used to there were 8 of us in the family, and I was number 4. And we used to, it was very, very common during the summers, they would take us on vacations. And my dad was an American history teacher. He was also, our dad was also an American history teacher. And so we would stop, we'd drive and he'd see this little sign about, historical markers or something. And we'd all pull over and we'd all go out and look at the biggest twine, and things like that. And he'd talk about it. And it was just really interesting. So I think that was partly where I always, in my head, I always thought, I'd really love to learn more about history too, from what I learned from him. What's interesting, though, is that when I got to high school and I wanted to become a teacher, there were 2 things that happened. First of all, I went to a group at the school about what he wanted to be. And I said, I think I want to be a teacher. And they said, oh, we don't need teachers anymore. There's plenty. This really was a stupid thing to say. And then the other thing is, but unless you go into special ed. And so that's kind of how I got into deaf education, was tied into that. But the other thing that I think that I remember is that he was really, I kept thinking, well, what area do I started as an elementary school teacher, but I didn't like it as much as I liked it when they were older. I like I said, I actually liked middle school and high school, but I ended up eventually liking elementary also, but first it was really interesting. So I was thinking a lot about that, and I decided I wanted to go into English instead as an area. And I was going into American history, but I kept thinking it was my dad's job. I didn't want it to be my dad's thing, so I didn't do it. But I've always been very interested, and that's really kind of why I'm doing this. It's just I find it really interesting, and I kind of want to let other people know how much fun it is. My aunt, my mom's sister, is a nun. So that's her in the middle. And she took care of 21 African American babies. And she ended up adopting 3 of them, even though she's a nun. And this is in Mississippi. And they're my godchildren, these 3 are. And Shamira and Dominic and Alex. But Shamira, when she was young, I remember she said one time when she came up, they were from Mississippi. And she said to me, are there any black people in this town? And at that time, there really weren't that many. There were, but there weren't many. And I just remember that ever since, kind of thinking, and that made me thinking more about the idea, were there black people back then? You know? I thought no. And when I was a student in Shakopee, I remember learning about Shakopee's history, but it was mostly focused on white men. Now, I'm a white man, and they're okay. They're fine. But I kept thinking, there's a lot more out there. And it started when I started looking at the women that were there way back when. And then I kind of moved on to these other areas, and I kept thinking, ooh, I'd like to find out more about this and that. So that's kind of what we're doing. So, I started looking at these people. I looked at James Griffin and Ellis Briggs and Dan Eddings. They're not, you don't know about them. When I grew up, I never learned about these people. There's no chapter about them in history. They're not really recognized. So their contribution has really been hidden. They're actually kind of buried in plain sight because they're there. We just didn't have it. If you look at the Shakopee story, the book, it's here somewhere, I'm sure. It is back there. But you won't find anything about African Americans in that book at all. But they were there. And I know that. I mean, that's just the way it works. There's the book, yeah. So I kept saying, oh, it's not there. And so, sometimes you'd find a little thing. Someone came up to me after I talked one time about African Americans, and someone said, you know what? Way back when in our house, there used to be a girl who I think she might have been a slave, I don't know. And that's the start. Once I find that, what can I find out more about that? Or I look into some of the journals. There's journals about Shakopee. And in all this book, which is from 18 whatever until when he died, and also then there's one line in there that says, Griffin, a black person, was, I hired this person here in Shakopee. That's all it says. Nothing, and it's like, who's Griffin? And that's the start. So each little thing, and I found several things like that when I looked at the history of Shakopee generally. There's nothing that you find. There's no book about that. except a little now, but that little bit is a start. So I'm going to share a few of the stories. And it started with this book, Northern Slave Black Dakota, by Wapa. And I read this about 4 years ago. I think when it was just published, I think it was about that too. And it would go around here in Shakopee, and it would ask people, have you heard of this person? And they'd say, no. But in the book, there's like 2 chapters that's specifically talking about in Shakopee. But there's nothing about that. And that's where it kind of started. I'm like, that's wrong. We need to teach them more breadth. So that's where it kind of started. So we start with Joseph Godfrey. And he wasn't in Shakopee because technically Shakopee wasn't named Shakopee at this point, so just so you know. But there is a place, the Faribault Trading Post. And it was downtown, the Shakopee House, if you know where that is, or
East of the bridge.
East of the bridge, yeah. There was a trading post here. And it's now at the landing here in Shakopee, okay? And so what I found out, though, is that Oliver Faribault, and that was one of the several Faribaults who were in Minnesota, and his wife, who was a Dakota Indian, they could speak French, English, and Dakota. And so they kind of blend all those cultures. And one of his daughters said once, he said, my father, Oliver Faribault, built the house, which was his home and trading post near Little Six, or Shakopee's village, in 1844. It was a fine point for a trading post. He was a very successful trader. I can very remember great packs of furs. And I was cool when I was reading a lot about them, as a thing, and it was really interesting. But what's interesting, the Faribaults had a slave. I've learned about Faribault, but I never learned that they had a slave. But they did. His name was Joseph Godfrey. And he was born probably in 1830. That's about guess for that. Died in July 1909. But he was in Shakopee from 1844 until probably 1848. And in 1848, he was in the trading post here and he escaped. Now it's interesting because I read a lot about the history in slavery, and I always thought it was kind of what they did down south. Those big plantations that are out there, right? But the fact is that when Fort Snelling was built, they allowed slaves to be brought to Fort Snelling. The federal government knew it and allowed it. They even budgeted for it. They actually gave our taxpayers dollars to defray the costs involved in keeping slaves up. And one of them had a child, and that was Joseph. He's born again in Mendota. He was a slave, and he was often whipped. He was not living with Oliver Faribault. He was living with his wife, Oliver's sister, I should say, and his family. So I'm going to explain how this works. Alex Bailey and Lucy Faribault Bailey. So this is the sister of Oliver. Okay? And these two were married. They had slaves. Their father had slaves too, they believe. Okay? What's interesting is that, according to Philander Prescott, there were 2 children in the family that one was a slave and one was a Dakota girl. They say they're probably 3 or 4 years old. And he says those two children, I actually believe, would get between 25 to 50 lashes a day, and sometimes more every day almost. I would frequently leave the house to get away from the miserable crying of those children when she was cowhiding them. Ew. In Minnesota. You know, that's kind of where I started with that when I was reading about this. And it's really interesting because this person had a daughter who went to help babysit at that family. But when this started happening, he took the kid back. Of course, he left the 2 kids, unfortunately.
But he took his daughter back?
He took his daughter back. So what happened is in Shakopee, in that same area, which is right across the Memorial Park, is where it's going to be a new history park here in Shakopee. But there was a Pond family that was living there in the Faribault Springs. And Alexander Huggins used to visit them he used to go to the Pond family. You know, like he said, they used to go once a year. And at one point, he must have talked to Joseph and told him that he should be free. Alexander was really strong abolitionist. I should let you know that I did have a stroke, so sometimes I can't catch the words up, but you'll see it up. That's why I put it up here to make sure you get it. Okay. He's interesting because he was really strong in his belief that they should not have slave owners in the group, the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions. Anyway, he lived at Traverse de Sioux, located about 40 miles upstream from the Faribault trading post. And when you look at what did he do, Joseph Godfrey, when he moved, so he was with that family, they gave him to Oliver's family. And he started about in 1844. But you know, he didn't write anything, he didn't know how to write. So we don't know exactly, but this is basically based on what we're finding out generally about this person. But around 1848, he escaped. They know that he walked 40 miles following the river. It was St. Peter's River, but then later became Minnesota River. And he went to Alexander Huggins' place. Okay. He was only there for a few days, and then he went back and lived with the Dakota who lived up in that area. And then he was involved in many other things that happened after, which we won't go too much into. But I just want to know that it's interesting that he was a person who was born in Minnesota. He was a slave. He was born a slave. He did escape. And when he got there, he said he had been beaten and abused. He could not stand it alone. Just so you know, later, he actually had 3 wives. All 3 of them were Dakota Indians. And he died on July 1st, 1909 in South Dakota. So here's, again, where we have just general. He was born, he married his first wife. He joined the Dakota in the U.S.-Dakota War. He was released in imprisonment. died. So again, when I found this, I found it so interesting because it's again the same. When I grew up, nobody told us that. I don't know why. And I don't know why there's not more information about this for sixth graders. When I've talked to this information to the sixth graders, it's really interesting because their response they're so into it and they're asking so many questions. They ended up, when I left, several of them went and they ended up contacting the author of the book, who then sent them a copy of the book. They asked all these questions, and then they did a presentation, the sixth graders did, about Joseph Godfrey. And so I knew that the students here in Shakopee, about 40% of them are people of color. And I kept thinking, if I'm going to present, I want to make sure that they're not just learning about certain white men, because they're great to have and were around and did some good stuff. But there were a lot of other things that were happening too. And so I wanted to make sure that happened.
Wait,
Yeah.
he testified against 11 of the 38.
Yes.
So, like, he testified against Chief John?
Yes, he did. And the book is actually in the library here, or not library, in the store here. And it's really interesting, the whole thing. He did testify to people 11 of them who were sentenced to die. And so that's a reason why a lot of people are very resistant even to the idea. But I think when you read the whole book all the way through, it makes it so interesting of what happened and why. He spoke mostly French and Dakota growing up. And then he learned English. His English was not great, to say, but it was okay, Personally, if you can learn more than one language, it's always a good thing. So it's just kind of interesting. Okay, now let's go to the next one, James Thompson. Now, I think on the chairs, there's some people that are popping up every once in a while. The problem is that they're not all of them are here, so that'll be hard. But Joseph Godfrey is this one right here. I want you to know that we don't have a picture of Jim Thompson. This is a picture based on the description in a book, but this is not necessarily really what it looks like exactly. Okay, so just so you know. But it's interesting. You do find a lot of information about Jim Thompson. There's nothing about him being in Shakopee. However, there is research that shows that he was in Shakopee starting about 1853 until 1860. And we actually have the census that show that he was in Shakopee. Of course, in the census, he's listed as white. His wife, who was a Dakota woman, was listed as white. Their two children, who were 1/4 white, 1/4 African American, and half Dakota, were listed as white. So just so you know, it's that's another thing that makes it interesting. So when you look at the research about African Americans in Minnesota, it doesn't say that there's any African Americans in Shakopee, but there were. Okay, they were either listed as white or they were in between census. So James and Mary were both in Shakopee. So just so you know, James Thompson was born on President Monroe's plantation. So see, I was remember about the plantation part, see, okay? And this situation now is true. He was a slave to Monroe's nephew. Probably his mother was probably raped by someone in the Monroe family. But he was given to the nephew, who then sold him to pay a gambling debt. And because of that, he ended up in the 1820s in Fort Snelling. And it's interesting because it ties in again, when you read all this stuff, you find out Harriet Robinson Scott and Dred Scott, where they were enslaved in Fort Snelling, which at that time was the Wisconsin Territory. What's interesting, here just so you know, where they were up in Fort Snelling, they were all over the place, and then they tried to get to be free, and the Supreme Court said no. But what's interesting is that Jim Thompson met them when they had their first baby. The baby was born on the ship heading up the Mississippi River to Fort Snelling, and say that his wife had just had a baby also, so they were visited for the first time. So I just think that's kind of interesting that they're tying even to the, we learn a little bit about Dred Scott often, and you go and you read, or you go to Fort Snelling, and there's some good information about that. But it's interesting that Jim Thompson was involved with that thing too, which is kind of interesting. Now, Jim Thompson was smart, and he used his skills and his wits to get free. He was a slave, but then the Reverend Alfred Brunson wanted him to become an interpreter for the Dakota because he was able to speak Dakota. His wife was Dakota, so that was part of it. So he got money by, I guess, really trying to get fundraising, got enough money in order to buy his freedom here. And then he hired him as an interpreter. And they were at but anyway, he was at this place, which is not too far from here. It's actually in West St. Paul. And this is kind of what it would look like. Now it's interesting because Alfred Brunson was good because he helped free knowledge of the Dakota language. And he made no interest, he didn't want to learn it. He believed it was a waste of time. So he's really blind to Dakota life ways. And when he finally left, saying that wasn't going to work, he blamed it on the shortcomings of the Indian character. Yeah, right. What makes this really interesting is that after this happened, Jim Thompson moved to St. Paul. I think that might say it in the next part. Oh, let me just say this. I'll come back to this. Okay. That's more as opposed to O-R-E, by the way.
Who's Fletcher Wing?
He was he did a lot of writing at that time, and this is when he mentions this in one of the books. I have to find the books. I'll find that for you. But it's just interesting because Now this is St. Paul area, but it's really pretty much saying, like if you look at Shakopee, people say, well, we should all be speaking English. But actually, it was Dakota first, and then it really became French. And it was much later, it became German actually a lot more, and they used that before it became English. So it's just interesting that people's view of that. Anyway, Jim Thompson lived in Pig's Eye in 1838, which later became St. Paul's Landing and then St. Paul. And he was really good at building stuff. And he helped erect the first house in St. Paul. Now this is not Shakopee yet, though. But it's interesting because he constructed the first Methodist church, which is in the Rice Park area. He furnished the building, the lumber, the shingles, and he gave his property to build the church. And in fact, you look, there was a sign, I don't know if it's still there now, but it mentions his name as the Negro interpreter here. So this was the first church in St. Paul. And he is, Jim Thompson really did a lot to make it happen. And Harriet Bishop, when you look at research, they also talk about they got her to come to Minnesota because he said, come and teach here. And he said his scholars were people who were English, French, Swiss, Sioux, Chippewa, and some with the African stock. And the African stock were actually the children of Jim and Mary, George and Sarah. In fact, he helped build what it became one of the first schoolhouses in St. Paul. So I just find it really interesting that at some point, started, I think it was in October 1865, this St. Paul Board of Education adopted a resolution stating that the mingling of children of African descent with those of white parenting is obnoxious to the views and feelings of a large portion of our citizens. And so they stopped. There were only 45 African Americans in St. Paul at that time, and they were not allowed to go to public school at that point. But this lasted only for a few years, but it's just kind of interesting. That's the point when Jim and Mary and George and Sarah ended up moving to Shakopee. Now, how do we know it happened? First of all, there's a book called A Sketch of Shakopee, Minnesota, 1891.
Available in the store.
Which also available in the store. And in there it says, this is the only thing it says, all the way through the whole thing says, Nigger Jim built where Michael Barron's store is. And that's what it said, and that's all it says. And so that was the beginning of me going, who's Jim? I'm saying Jim, okay. And so it's really interesting. I started there to find out what more I could find. I say that this is really something I just say for the students, really, but you should know better yourself. But anyway. But it's interesting here about they often do couple with person's proper name. So, and Jim was, common. Who was that person in Shakopee in 1853 whose name was Jim? And it ends up being Jim Thompson. Now, how do we know that? Okay, first of all, we have to look at the store. Michael Barron's Fruit and Confectionery store was located on the north side of First Street, downtown, for 25 years. Before that, it was Jim Thompson's store of some kind. Evidence of what? No, we don't know. Working on that, but okay. But if you look at the Stanford,
Sanford.
No,
the maps.
Sanborn.
Yeah, if you look there and find there's a confectionery store, and that's the same place, so we know kind of where it is. This building, this area was torn down, so it's not there now, but it would be where now there are apartments in this area. Okay, it doesn't say anything about Jim Thompson, but we'll work on that. And so it's interesting, Walt Bakken, when I talked to him, he said it's interesting because it appears beyond doubt that Scott County, which is here, where Shakopee is, was home of two of the best known African Americans of early Minnesota, Joseph Godfrey and Jim Thompson. And you can find, how we can find out if we look at, here's the 1857 census. And the barns, look at, they're all white, if you look at the thing along here, right? So there's William Barnes, Sarah Barnes, Mary Barnes, James Thompson, Mary Ann Thompson, George A. Thompson, and Charles St. Clair. And that's how we know the connection, because Jane Thompson adopted Charles St. Clair. Because, and it was because he was part Dakota, or part Dakota anyway. He was adopted by them so that they would get 40 or 400 acres of land at the same time. Now, how are they tied into the barns is interesting. Sarah Thompson married a Barnes, William Barnes. Okay, so he was white, but the rest of them were not white. Partly, a couple, well, all of them, I guess, could be some, are all partly. So maybe that's why they call it that. I don't know. It's just kind of interesting to see. So again, the census in 1857 and 1860 says he was white. He wasn't. Okay. And so, again, Jim Thompson and his two kids, I think again are here somewhere, but it's just interesting that they were here in Shakopee and they were at least part African American. I was just looking, this is just recently, this unfortunately wasn't very clear, so I typed it up, but it's just interesting. So they gave him some money. He was at the very end of his life at this point. Go ahead.
What association was he a member of?
The call it Old Settlers Club, and he and they met and they gave this money to him. He had moved from here in Shakopee after 1860. He moved to St. Paul with his daughter and the Barnes family moved to St. Paul. And then from there, they moved to their son's family in further west.
Do you think that's correct, that he was the only
Yes.
black person
Yeah,
ever?
that I knew there's a thing. It was the same thing. This is wrong
Yeah, I would think so.
because we just saw that with number one, didn't
Right.
we?
Yeah.
Okay, Joseph Godfrey. So, but this is what was said in the news. I'm just saying that for that. But yes, no, that's good to. I'm glad you said it because I was going to say it and I forgot it. It's really important to know that. He is the only member who was a member of the association who was one of the persons who were first settlers in St. Paul area. So
we've
that
had,
part is right.
we've had fake news for a long time.
Yeah, of course. And it says colored, I think it's the word that they used here in this thing, I think it's colored.
Yeah.
And so in 1884, Bob, Mary, and Jim died. And they, at his son's place, in the Dakota area, not in Minnesota. I can't remember the exact, I should say exactly where, but I can't think it in my head right now. So, but there's a lot of information about Jim Thompson, not as much about his wife, not too much about their children, but it's just interesting because there is a lot of information because in St. Paul, he was one of the first person other than the Dakota who lived there.
And do his relatives still live there?
They went to the Dakota area, and I think that's where they still live. I would have to find out more to know more about that. Do anybody else know about that? Or no, not, okay. But there's a lot out there, so I'll look and find out some more. And if I find it, I'll let people know too. Now, here comes the next one. Mr. Griffin. This is not a picture of him, just so you know. We don't have a picture. But again, there was a book. I don't know if it's in our thing or not.
Yep.
All right. The Diary of Daniel M. Storer. And he wrote a journal from that time about what was happening. And so what's interesting is he often mentions a lot of people's names and what was going on. And in all of that whole book, there's two things that he talks about with African Americans, and one is this one. And it says, a black man by the name of Griffin commenced working for me on the 9th. And this is May 9th, 1854. So again, this becomes a thing like, who's Mr. Griffin? Okay. I added the Mr. Griffin because I wanted to make sure it wasn't some other name for the poor guy. And actually, I was kind of glad that this guy, Daniel Storer, said Griffin as opposed to N somebody or other. Okay. So we know that he built many of the early houses in Shakopee. We know that he was there at least for a year doing that work in Shakopee. The buildings are not there now, because unfortunately. But I was reading other things, and I found this, and this is how I tied into Griffin, that his name was James Griffin. And this continues on, so I'll continue to the next part. So Emily Gray, there's also a lot of interesting things about her and what she's been doing. But she wrote this article, which ended up being in Minnesota history, called "The Black Community in Territorial St. Anthony," a memoir. And in there, he had that little bit there. And I was like, when I read that, on me, I was just reading because I found this interesting to read about. I was like, so I found out more, because according to them, if I go back again, it says they were located in Shakopee, afterwards taking land near Buffalo. So my question is that Buffalo, Minnesota, or Buffalo, New York, or something? So I contacted the Wright County Historical Society and found out. He was born in Prince George's County, Maryland, around 1822. Sometimes it says 1824, so it's you know. He had his master didn't want to be in the Navy, so he had him do it for him, which they used to do. And he was in the Navy for 5 years. He learned the carpenter trade. Then he married Mary Brown in Philadelphia in 1849. And he was given freedom in exchange for his Navy service. So at least the master at least gave him freedom after working for 5 years in the Navy. So he worked on a steamboat builder in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he came to Minnesota in 1854 on the Minnesota Belle. And then from there to Shakopee, Minnesota Territory. So I looked about the Minnesota Belle, and it's really interesting because they built this, again, in Belle Vernon, Pennsylvania, a fine new boat, 170 feet long, and he christened it Minnesota Belle, and he loaded it with immigrants, and on May 3rd started up the Minnesota River. And one of the person who was there, or in there, was James Griffin, Mary Brown Griffin, and their 4 children. But as they got to Little Rapids, going down the river, right, near Carver, it was not deep enough, and they got stuck. They had to bring it back to Shakopee, and all the supplies and stuff were taken out here in Shakopee. And so did the family, who ended up living here then for 3 years. Oh, here's what it says. So, I read about this. It talks a lot about this, but it's kind of interesting that within all that, who was the person who, of many probably, who ended up moving into Shakopee because of that, was the Griffins. I do believe the 4th one, which is Martin, also was born then when they got here. So these are the years that we're thinking, 1853 to 1856. I do know that in February of 1856, they moved out of Shakopee. And this is what he did. He worked as a carpenter. He was a teamster in 1856. And he had wagons with teams to help families settle in the territory. And so 2 families from Shakopee, the Ackley and the Overton families, were brought to Lake Buffalo. And when he was there, he brought them there. And then someone there came up to him and said, "We want you to move here too." And he, after a lot of discussion, he ended up coming back here, brought his family, and that spring came back to, or almost spring came here. Yeah, it was Jim Sturgis who convinced him. So we do know that then they came there outside Buffalo. They started a stagecoach line, and they had a route between Buffalo and Monticello, and from Monticello to Minneapolis. So we do know that about him. So we know a little bit more once they're out of Shakopee, but it's just interesting. And here in a history book, it talks about that. And I found several articles, books that mentioned him in Buffalo, because he was, quote, an intelligent colored man. But basically, he also was the one who had the team and the horses, and so he helped a lot of people in the process too. And so it looks like at that point, the family that were from here, they added 2 more children here. Ended up being in Buffalo. This is again his wife. Again, this is not a real photo. I mean, sorry, it's a real photo of somebody. I just put that on there as a person to have visual of that. Okay, that's why the little stars up there, just so you know, so you can see that. And she was born in Virginia and died in 1882 in Minneapolis. And this is again what happened in this time. I'm going to continue to move on. So, and just so you know, there you can see his name is Griffin. It was true that it was not his daughter, who was almost white looking, his stepdaughter, was not the one who got the land. It was somebody else there. But they think she was also involved in other land that he purchased. And here's, he was able to read and write, as you can see here, that's his writing. Here's a little advertising about his thing, you know. So he was quite involved, related to as a stagecoach driver. And they had their children. And again, I think some of them are around here, the thing, just so you know. What's interesting is that he took all 5 of his children, he gave them each 16 acres of land, so that when he died, they would continue on. What's interesting is that many of, like Louisa and Estella, they both, James Griffin's grandson, 2 of them both are related to history of Minnesota and African Americans in Minnesota. So there's a lot more information about his grandchildren.
Do we know what part of Virginia she's from?
No, it doesn't say. I would like to know, so find out. I've been looking, I'm like on Ancestry.com and stuff, and I'm working on it. So far, nothing yet. But what is interesting with this one is that she was born at a German Catholic church in St. Paul, or Minneapolis, I think it is. She was light skinned, yes. But we don't know how much. And we don't think she was Catholic. But her family did live close by. So it's just interesting. There is a stone, but it's really hard to see. It's flat in the ground, and it's almost gone. The only part that was kind of covered up, when you take that away, you can see a little bit, and it said, "May she rest in peace." Amen. So that's what we know about her. And James Griffin then died in Post Springs, Arkansas. He worked in the courthouse after a while in Buffalo, and then he sold the farm and then moved to Post Springs, Arkansas, where he died in 1891. Okay. But it's just interesting, again, people. I remember finding this one too, which is, it says, all of Mr. Griffin's many friends will be sorry to learn that he has been taken from St. Barnabas Hospital to the insane asylum, that's what happened there. Starting to lose your mind, probably. And then he ended up dying, and he's buried here in Minnesota. Okay. and that's where he's buried. So I just think it's interesting because we find out all the way through, but it's interesting that he was here in Minnesota in Shakopee for at least 3 years. I just think that's kind of interesting information. Now I'm going to go through this next one kind of fast, but because this is not really related to African Americans directly. But we have a street in town called Fuller Street, right? I think it's very close to here, isn't it? Okay. It's interesting. This person here is David Fuller, and he came to Shakopee. There were actually 3 brothers, 3 sisters. They arrived to St. Paul in 1850. And David Fuller arrived in Shakopee for a short time in the summer of 1851, and then he came back 1 year later, and with Thomas Holmes, they made a half interest in the township. So he basically owned half the town of Shakopee. He also purchased Chasta. So he had lots of money. But what's interesting is how he got that money. They were merchants, and they owned a store in St. Paul, and they had a trading post and real estate business. It's interesting, you go to the Minnesota Historical Society site, and they actually have information about the Fuller family and show like they used to document everything, how much money they make and how much everything like that. So it's just kind of interesting for that. And even in the Valley Herald here in Shakopee, they paid $110,000 for it. But what's interesting is that slave holders and Southerners spent vacations hold in that hotel. In other words, about $6,000 a month they would get from the people from the South would come up to Minnesota during the warm time down south up to St. Paul, and they lodged their slaves in St. Paul, and they allowed it to happen. I just find that very interesting. So it's just interesting how that happened in Minnesota. When he died. But anyway, I just want to say a little tie into this. Joseph Farr was an African American person, and he was part of the Underground Railroad here in Minnesota. And he came to St. Paul in 1850, and he worked in a barber shop. But what I find interesting is that he talks about the Fuller Hotel. And he says it was patronized by Southern people. There was a planter stopping there with his family once, and he had a young slave woman in whom he became interested. And we thought we ought to free him if we could. She was told that she would get away and that she would wanted to go. So one day while the family was out, we got the girl out and took her to a hiding place. It was a great row about her disappearance, and the owner was very upset. And it took a couple days, to get everything organized, because they were going to take her and move her to Chicago and then up north to Canada. And at some point, the girl got homesick and decided to go back in this situation. And they said, Joseph Farr said, of course, there was no son trying to help a slave to escape when she didn't want to, and we let him go back. So that did happen at the Fuller Hotel. There's another example. The Fuller House eventually they switched the name to the International Hotel, and Mrs. Prince of New Orleans stayed at the hotel. This is in 1860 with the slave. but he escaped from her by sneaking out the building. So just interested again with the Fuller from here, but it's really where they got that money is really tied into the whole thing. It's just interesting to think about. So they did, when you talk about Underground Railroad with the students, they really find that very interesting that was still happening, or was happening in Minnesota also. Okay, I gotta keep going here. Thomas Holmes people used to say he was the father of Shakopee or something like that. I always found that so interesting because there were 600 people living in a village, Tinta before Shakopee even was here. So it's kind of interesting, but once he was here, he ended up going to the gold fields in Idaho and Montana, starting 1862 to 1867. 3 times he went there. And it's interesting that in those trains, like they have a list of who were in the trains when they went there. And one was Tom, who's a cook, and he was a Negro. So that's interesting. And they have a thing that said a Negro named Tom accompanied the St. Paul builder contractor and acted as his cook. And cooks, were used a lot. They often play the fiddle or the harmonica or guitars, and they enjoy that also. So it's interesting because when we look at the research then in the West, we found that there's a first settler in Prickly Pear Village includes an unidentified African American male, one who was 3 who first discovered gold deposit in the Helena area. There's a whole story about Helena. One of them it was the person who named that in Montana as someone from here in Helena. Whatever. All right. So this could be tied in. We don't know too much more about this. But they do know that Thomas Holmes did do 3 different trips. And you want to find out more, but they don't have much detail about the 2 people who were African Americans. But we do know that the second one for sure was not a slave. So I'm going to move on to this. Okay, I'm going to move to the next part. We continue with the wagon trains. There are 3 of them. And the second one was in 1864, 63, 64. What's interesting there is that there was an orderly in the 1st Minnesota Cavalry Mounted Rangers who was African American. They were headed towards the Dakota Territory to get rid of those Dakota Indians. Just get rid of them, okay? The wagon train came and then wanted to go with them so they could continue on through and had someone to protect them. And that's what happened. So Thomas Holmes' group went on with this other group. Now, there are 3 people from Shakopee who were the Weiser brothers. There's William, Josiah, and Joel. All 3 of them are related to African Americans because the doctor, which is the middle one, who ends up being killed, his orderly was African American. William was working down south during the Civil War, and he brought back, they believe, 12 former slaves who went to Eden Prairie area. 10 of them and the other one came to Shakopee. And the other tied-in with the black is Joel, this other of the family. He had black hair. After he went to the Civil War, he came back, he had malaria, and he turned his hair white. So it's all kind of tied into black. So that's why all right. So he was born in Pennsylvania, and his family moved to St. Paul, and then in 1857 was in Shakopee. And so they were at the Battle of Big Mount, Dakota Territory, July 24th, 1863. And it's, this book, which I find really was interesting, is I was reading that book just to find out information about this, and in there it says that he was from Shakopee, Minnesota, and he lived among the Dakotas here in Shakopee and learned their language and served as their doctor. And it is true, I've been finding out more stuff about here in Shakopee. What happened is they were there, the Dakota came, and they went to meet so they could, talk, I guess, at that point. And I remember pulled a gun and shot, as opposed to short, Dr. Wisner in the back. He probably thought he was Sibley. And then they drove away. Okay. The orderly, who was African American, raced back to camp screaming, "They killed the doctor." Okay. And then the battle became because of that. What's interesting about this is I talked to the author of this book and others. They can't find the name of who this person is. I'm working on that still, who this orderly was. But it's kind of interesting. The author said everything he finds says mostly just bad things about him because he ran back and let them know that the doctor was killed. But anyway. The sad part, of course, is that Little Six placed the number of Indians killed as 26. And the sad part is that people that they were killing were actually not involved with the thing in Minnesota. And they ended up being probably a lot more died after that. So anyway, the next one was Joseph Allen. He was in 1864. Again, this is not his pictures. But if you look at the Shakopee Argus, you'll find a list of people who came from Saratoga, New York, and it includes Joseph Allen, and he was African American, and he was free. It was clear that he was free. He also he was a hack driver, and so he must have had some money in order to participate in this because it costs a lot in order to do this. And see, he's mentioned when he got to Montana. Used to be Idaho, but I think at that time. I've contacted the author of this book, this article, who told me to go to talk to somebody else, which I did, then went to another person. And that person's finding out more about this. So we will find out more. She didn't know either, except that, she heard about this art thing too. So we will find out more about this, but I just want you to at least know. So again, it's Joseph Allen was also tied. All right, I really want to emphasize this one. This is Dan Eddings. He was in Shakopee from 1864 to 1919. That's a picture of him. It's from here. Okay? In fact, I'm not sure. I don't remember if someone, but anyway, someone said, there's a black person in one of these photos. So that's how I really found this. And then I looked to find out what I could find out. And again, he brought him from the South. And I found in two newspapers about him. It's interesting here again, it says in the article, it says Dan Eddings, better known to Shakopee people as N. Dan, died at the county poorhouse. So it's just interesting, you know. But it was there, it was in the paper saying that, so it's just interesting. And he worked on farms here in the Shakopee area for many years. And then he took this picture. Here's the name of the photography person. Yeah. And he took this picture of him in 1915. And of course, this is what it says in the back. Okay. And it's interesting that 2 years later, he dies. He ended up having, he had stomach cancer. And he was taken to the poorhouse here in Shakopee. And he died in August of 1919. And he was buried here at Valley Cemetery, right there. But there's nothing, there's no stone there. There's nothing about it. And it's just kind of interesting to me. And I've talked to this, a lot of people are really interested in getting a tombstone of this because he did, you know, he sat and worked his butt off here, you know, at various farms and stuff. And then when he couldn't work anymore, they put him in the poorhouse. And then, of course, they didn't have him, so they just put him in the potter's field. So I just think it's very interesting. And I do know exactly where it is at the Valley Cemetery here in town. And because there's someone there working and showed me exactly where I had the number, because if you look here, you can find out that information. So I just think it's really interesting. So that's Dan Eddings. The next one that we know of is Alice Briggs. You felt good. Very good. I'm glad someone brought it up. Thank you. Now, that's not really her picture. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture. But we find it really interesting. Orestes S. Brown was born in New York, and they moved to Shakopee in 1869. Okay. His wife died, and they lived in a farm between Hamilton, which is Savage, and Shakopee in Glendale. And then in 1880, they moved to a house in downtown Shakopee. And he had a second wife, and they had their two children. And they had an indentured servant, Alice Briggs, who was African American. There's a book called A Walking Tour of Historic Shakopee, which is also in the thing, and it shows this place, which is a very old house in Shakopee, built in 1856, and that's where she lived and worked. That's what the house looks like. It's right across the street from what used to be the First Presbyterian Church, and is now this Mexican church. I'm not going to say it out loud. I can't say it well. So. But it's just so you know where it is. It's downtown. And again, you see, it's interesting that we had the husband and wife, two children. Then you have Alice. She's 15 and she's black. Okay. Then there's two who are married together who are white. Okay. One's 20, one's 23. They're both servants. And then there's a boarder. And the boarder was insane, it says on the thing. So I'm not sure exactly, but obviously there was that servants were there, partly probably was to, I don't know, take care of that person, I guess. When you go to the next census, of course, 1890, there's nothing about them anymore. That person, I should say. But they do say that Alice did a lot of laundry, and it was not a fun job. This is not a picture of him, just so you know. Her, I should say. That's my stroke. Sometimes I do he and she, just saying. And it's not a fun job. I'm not going to go into this because I'm worried about time, but I just want you to know that it was an awful job. And what's interesting about all this is there's supposedly, and we don't have any info more yet, but they say there was a ghost that looked like African American who worked in the backyard of this house. So I just find that very interesting. So I'm trying to find out more. Unfortunately, it's hard to find the thing, but the person who's living there now, he's not doing so well, and his son, but we're working on finding out more information. But they do remember at one point telling the story about the ghost that was in that area. Okay. And hey, if I had to be doing the laundry all the time, I'd be a ghost too. All right, here's a quick one. I just want to know, but just here's the idea of someone who came to town to do a concert. John William Blind Boone. He was in Shakopee October 20th, 1890. Just interesting that he's related, his mother was related to Daniel Boone, which is interesting because I think that's somehow related to me too, but I'm not sure how. He got brain fever, went to the school for the blind, and he used to play the piano. A new superintendent came and said black students were not allowed to play piano. No comment, but you know. So he got kind of mad, and he left school, and he listened to African Americans who worked in the saloons there, and principal found out and dismissed him. But he ended up with his mother, this is his agent, a producer, and this is a piano teacher who ended up working with him. He was really a good, well-known person. In the 1900s, they say he was among the most popular acts in the country, and he would play 300 dates annual. Okay, and one of them was here in Shakopee. And in the diary of Daniel Storer, it says, the night of the 20th, Blind Boone gave a concert here. He is a splendid pianist, the best I ever heard. So again, just these little things that he puts in, if you can find that. And in the newspaper, the Courier, here in Shakopee, it said, the Boone concert was well attended on Monday night and was as usual with him a fine performance, both in the piano playing and singing, for Boone is quite a very pleasing singer. His pieces were a grand selection, and his imitations of various instruments, cyclones, and thunderstorms were as natural as possible. Miss Stella sang along on several occasions. He was a wonderful performer, and his concerts were always well conducted. So again, just interesting that here in Shakopee, when they're bringing in, they brought in stuff all the time. It's just interesting that this is here too. And he died October 4th, 1927. All right. Quick here. All right. Old Joe. That's his name. Sorry, last name didn't have it. That's kind of sad too. All right, in Shakopee, there used to be a person named Frank Rivers. Used to be called that, but I can't say it anymore. And he owned a copper shop in Shakopee. When the flour bags were invented, he quickly sold his business and bought the Red Rock Lake Farm in Eden Prairie in 1874. And that's just across the river here from Shakopee. So here's Frank and his first wife and his second wife. But he was, again, a slave himself. He moved from Minnesota probably the same time that Dan Eddings was brought to Shakopee, I think. He lived with the Revere family in Shakopee and Eden Prairie, and then with the Horace Goodrich family. So it's probably on here somewhere, but I'm just moving on. But he also drove horses for Dr. Fisher here in Shakopee when he used to make house calls. And he also drove a carriage. Okay. And that's right across. So Shakopee would be over here. He was buried in Shakopee at Eden Prairie Cemetery with a little wooden cross for his grave. And someone who remembers it talks about this. So I don't think there's a grave there now for him. But again, Old Joe, as it was called, was here. And finally, so these are people who were in Shakopee back then. And so I want to give you that as a beginning, but I want you to know that I'm continuing to find out more. Both more might be there, but also about these people too. But I did want to know that there are 3 others that we're also kind of looking at. All right, the first one is the American Range Company in Shakopee. The daughter of a person who was a cop in Shakopee at one time, he said, my dad used to tell me about people who worked at the American Range Company in Shakopee. They were very tall, and their skin was blue-black in color, very dark, very hard workers. But I can't find out anything about this yet. So I'm working on this, but I just want to know. So that's the thing. Did that happen? I think probably, because if they bring it up, telling stories, when you pass things down, if it's not written, it's hard to know, except that if they're saying something like that, there's probably some truth in it. So this is the Minnesota Stove Company, and we have information here about that, but nothing about the African Americans or Africans who work there. So we're working on that. This picture, here's from a picture, I think this is 1909, I think, but just a picture of downtown Shakopee. And it's not very clear, except this is not the best photo either, but this person's African American, that person's African American. And I think there's 2 more back here that are definitely African American. Who I don't know. I'm trying to find out, but that's the kind of thing that I find. And then the other thing is African American baseball team. There was a team called the Reserves, and it was in Shakopee in the 1870s. This is not a picture of it, that's just a picture of the thing, just so you know. But in this book, it does talk about the quick steps. Next match was in Shakopee against the Shakopee Reserves, and they were defeated handily. Okay. That's probably why we don't know about it. No, but what's interesting is this is all in African American newspaper, and we're finding more about it in there, but we don't know for sure. Like, were they African American? Possibly. Because it pops up in the thing. In fact, I think here's an example. In Chaska, there was William Frame Billy Williams, and there's an article was in the newspaper about that not too long ago in Shakopee Bell News. And so they were there. And, you know, here's a, like, I'm finding slowly from the Globe about Shakopee Reserve. This is not Bob Schmidt.
It says the fare is $1.40. Would that have been like on a steamer? I mean, that's a gigantic.
That seems a
sum of
lot to
money.
me too, but I
I
don't,
think it's a train.
probably train is my guess too.
It's a train from Union Depot.
Yeah, yeah, was my guess too. And Bob is the one who told me too. He said, I want more information because there is something, it was in that book and there's potential there. So again, a thing that I'm trying to find out. Again, I'm from Shakopee Heritage Society. This is that kind of information, but there's also brochures there if you want information. And we are going to have eventually this spring, at least a beginning book that we'll have out on African Americans in Shakopee, just so that our students have a place to go to start to find out more. Okay, so good timing, kind of. All right, so any last questions there at the end there? Did you learn something new?
Yes.
I hope so. I mean, I find it really interesting myself. This is just me. I love finding something that's really I hadn't heard before, and it's really fun teaching this to sixth graders because they really into this kind of stuff.
Dave, you can mention it's going to be on our website. We're downloading this on our website.
Oh, cool.
Just want to mention to everyone, please, there's a survey that was on your chair tonight, and we would be very grateful if you would take a minute or two and just fill that out for us. There's a basket up here by the cookies that you can leave the survey in tonight. I'd appreciate that.
And please leave your little pictures. We didn't really show too much about, but I'm going to keep them because I'm using it with the students again. So.
Thanks, Gabe.
Yeah.
There's lots of cookies left.
Because those both are sixth graders in town. And so,
all the sixth graders are just a small part.
well, I let them know, I let all of them know, and then they let me know. Last time I had about 140 in the sixth grade center, and I think about 80 at the Saks. And that's been for a couple of years now, and again, this shortly. They seem to like it a lot. I'm sure the teachers enjoy it. And we have activities that we do also with Thai kids too.
Actually, no, we'll just leave the cookies and then take a cookie after.
No, I do that, me and my nieces and nephews.
I got one quick
There's
question for
several of
everybody.
them, so there's 18 of them.
How did you,
Your website. Your website.
our website,
Your newsletter.
our newsletter?
Facebook.
Facebook?
Yeah, someone named Kathy invited me.
Okay. Great, thank you. It helps us to know how we're reaching people, so I appreciate that.
Oh, yes, definitely. Do you have the information about it? Is that-
Yes.
We do author talks every once in a while, and this was for Black Americans. He's been doing a lot of research.
Well, you have,
I'll be in touch with you.
okay, sounds good.
Someone out of the month. And then we have